I am Mark Blythe, the Director of the Rhodes Institute, and this is the first talk of the year for the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance. Delighted to have with us today Kimberly Clausing, whose book you can see there, open, is The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration and Global Capital. Very much swimming against the current. Kim and I first met last year when we talked about this book on a Financial Times podcast, and I enjoyed it so much that I've assigned it in class today. Hello, everyone who's in my class today, and also to bring her here to Watson, because I think it's a series of very important arguments to put perspective on what's going on now. Kimberly is a Harvard PhD in economics who has worked at Reed College for a large chunk of her career. And she's worked with the Center for Equitable Growth, has held Fulbrights and done a whole bunch of things. But the current thing that we're concerned with is open. And I'll leave it to Kimberly to tell us about it and then to do the talk afterwards.
So thanks everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you about these ideas, and thanks to Mark and Peter for inviting me. So they've told me to speak for about 35 minutes and then we'll go to questions. So today I'm going to talk about our present moment in economic history, which has been characterized by dramatic increases in income inequality and also for wage stagnation for much of the population. It's a very troubling time, and in that context, I'm going to discuss why I view today's economic policy response to that to be completely upside down and backwards. And in particular, to give you the punchline first, I'll argue that we'd be far better off with an open economy, progressive tax system, and a more adequate safety net than with what we're pursuing now, which is a more nationalistic economic policy, more isolationism from our allies, and also a weaker safety net with a less progressive tax system. The set of policies that we're pursuing now, I think, is particularly disadvantageous to American workers, but it's also dangerous for the future of peace and prosperity. So I thought what I'd start off with is what's going on with American workers and then sort of build the argument from there. So if you look at this picture here, this gives you, in a nutshell, part of what's wrong with the economy over the last several decades. So over these 35 years, you see the blue line is an increase in GDP per capita. And these are both in real terms adjusted for inflation. So if we sort of shared the extra GDP growth that we'd had evenly across society, we could expect the typical person to have almost $20,000 more purchasing power over the last 3.5 decades than they did at the beginning of that period. But instead, we see the median household income as that red dashed line, and the progress in that area has been much weaker, right? So there's been a little bit of progress, but not sort of what prior generations of Americans had come to expect. And of course, the reason for that is that growth has been much more skewed in this most recent period than it was historically. So if you look at the 35 years after World War II, one of the most remarkable things, especially to young people in this room, because you sort of almost assume that there has to be economic inequality, but we actually had a lot of wage compression in that period and more equal incomes at the end of that period than at the beginning, because income growth for the bottom parts of the population was actually higher than for those at the top. So the bottom 90% see roughly a doubling of their income over that first 35 years post-World War II. And the growth for the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1% is actually smaller than for those at the bottom. But if you go fast forward to the last 35 years, you see the bottom 50% have almost no increase in their income, right? And then the 50th to 90th percentile have income growth, but it's not what they expected. It's about a third what they had in the prior era. And then there's this incredible amount of income growth at the top, right? And so that's a troubling problem for our economy, because we like to think that, economic growth should raise all boats, but it's really not doing that lately. So why has that happened? A lot of important things have changed over those 35 years, and it's easy to point fingers at globalization as one of the potentially problematic features of the world. We have seen more trade, more immigration, more global capital mobility over this later period than we saw in the earlier period. But I would point out that a lot of other things are changing too. So if you look at technology, for instance, if you go back to 1980, it was very different from what it is now. Computers and automation and the internet have dramatically expanded in a way that systematically has shifted labor demand away from those with the least skill and towards those, like those of us in the room, with more skills and education. Right, and that's been a big part of this story, too. We've also seen more market power in the U.S. economy by almost any measure. The big companies are more powerful than they were before. We've seen the nature of labor markets change with the decline of unionization, more competitive, sort of fissuring of labor market tasks such that some labor markets are now fiercely competitive. We've seen social norms change in a way that is troubling. So CEOs, for instance, now earn 300 times what the typical worker does in their company. And that ratio used to be 30 times in 1980, and you might think, well, 30 times is already a lot. 300 times, you know, to support that with an economic argument, we need to have some reason to think that CEOs are more than, you know, an order of magnitude more productive relative to their workers now than they were 35 years ago. And I think most people argue that that's not an economic thing, but rather a change in norms. And there's also been really important policy changes over this period, right, including tax policy, which is an area that I focus on a lot. There have been lighter tax burdens at the top and also lighter tax burdens on capital income. So we're going to have to come back to all of those stories. But those causal factors, one thing I'll point out is they're difficult to disentangle, right? You might think, well, technological change can enable trade. Trade can influence the nature of technological change, social norms and policy, and all these other things really interact, and that's something to keep in mind. But another thing to keep in mind is that these big forces of trade and technological change have affected almost every economy on the planet. But if you look at what's happening on the ground in terms of income inequality and wage stagnation, outcomes are really different in different countries. And so I think what that tells you from the get-go is that economic policy matters, social norms matter, and these other factors matter too. So what I'm going to do with the rest of this talk is sort of talk about two features of globalization, trade and immigration, and how they affect American workers, and then come back to this problem here and sort of ask, what do we do about this problem if we're going to absolve the foreigners from blame, which is one of my intentions here, is to say that this isn't all the fault of our trading partners or our immigrants, right? So let's start with international trade. So international trade comes with a lot of benefits, and I emphasize those a lot in the book, and chapters 3 and 5 of the book are about the many benefits of trade. These shouldn't be ignored, but I'm not going to talk about them today. Today I'm going to talk more about the costs of trade, right? And one of the costs of trade is that it can generate a fair amount of disruption. So for instance, a team of researchers have looked at the China shock, which was this big increase in imports coming in from China over in particular, the first decade of this century, but you know, it's sort of in the surrounding years as well. And they used geographic variation to sort of isolate the effects of the China shock. So for instance, in Nevada, you're pretty free of the China shock. You know, the industries in Nevada aren't directly competing with Chinese imports. But if you look at Mississippi, for instance, it looks like there's a lot of China shock counties in Mississippi. And the researchers used that to discover an estimate of U.S. job loss due to these Chinese imports, which is about 1 to 2 million jobs over that entire period. Now, that sounds bad, and I think we should take it seriously. And I also think it's interesting to note that the regions that are hit by this China shock are also regions that have tended to embrace sort of polarized political responses to this adversity. And so these are important issues. But it's also, I think, important to keep these numbers in perspective. So it's possible, for instance, that while Chinese imports cost jobs in some sectors of the economy, they created jobs in other sectors of the economy, because U.S. companies using Chinese imported steel, for instance, could be more productive when facing competitors in other countries because their costs were lower. But even if you ignore that, another point to keep in mind is that this is 1 to 2 million jobs lost over, you know, a decade. But the U.S. economy generates just an enormous amount of job loss every single quarter. So the typical quarter in the United States, that's got millions on the vertical axis here, we see over 6 million jobs lost in the typical quarter. And the job gains, which I have in blue, are also typically over 6 million, right? So we live in this incredibly dynamic capitalism that comes with all sorts of disruption all the time, right? As Schumpeter called it creative destruction, right? So you've got the creation in blue, you've got the destruction in red, but there's a lot of job churn in the US economy. People lose their jobs to domestic competition all the time. Walmart comes to town and some smaller shops close. They lose their jobs to robots, and that's a big source of job loss, right? They lose their jobs to fads and changes in consumer preferences, and that's something that happens in our economy. But fortunately, there's also a lot of job creation. Another thing to keep in mind is if you look at the U.S. manufacturing share of employment, and this is part of what people worry about, is the loss of these good manufacturing jobs, right? But that's been in steady decline for 70 years, since 1950. So it's hard to pick out, if you look at the share of U.S. workers making manufacturing goods, it's hard to pick out trade shocks in here because the decline is so steady and, downward over the entire period. And so you might be concerned, you might say, okay, well, if these manufactured jobs are the good jobs and we're steadily losing them, then we should do kind of whatever we can to stop that. But I would point out that this is a common trend in a lot of countries. Even some emerging economies have seen a declining manufacturers' share in employment. And a lot of this is due to technological change, right? You can make manufactured goods with more and more technology and fewer workers, and this is going to happen naturally, right? And we see it in a lot of other countries, too. Another thing to point out before you dismiss service jobs is that a lot of you are probably aspiring to be service workers yourselves. Like, do you want to work in a manufacturing plant? Maybe. But most of us think of service jobs as there are good service jobs, right? And there are not good service jobs. But what I do is a service job, and it generates export income for the United States because foreign students' tuition dollars count as U.S. U.S. service exports, right? So it's not clear that, service jobs are always bad jobs, right? Some of them we may not want to be folding T-shirts at the Gap for our lives, but some of them are good jobs too. Okay, so what is the policy import of this? Well, you could argue, okay, this is a lot of churn. It's greater than the churn that we see due to the China shock. But we can't do anything about the march of the robots, and social norms are difficult to change. But what we can do is we could reverse some of this trade. And it's actually pretty easy to reverse trade. If you go back in history, the last big era of globalization was reversed by policy changes of governments who decided to raise tariffs and reduce the amount of trade. So the next policy question is, should we? Would that help workers? If we can't stop the robots, we can stop the imports. Should we do that? And my answer to that is a solid no, for reasons that prioritize workers at the heart of this conversation. So there's, I think, 3 dangers to workers of restricting trade. One is in their role as producers, right? And we've run this experiment a little bit over the last couple of years, right? As we've raised tariffs on trading partner goods, those trading partners have retaliated. We see higher Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods, higher Indian tariffs on U.S. goods, higher European tariffs on U.S. goods, and those have created shocks in those export industries that used to produce those goods. So farmers, for instance, in the upper Midwest are quite dissatisfied with the fact that they can't sell their soybeans to the Chinese market. General Motors paid over $1 billion in tariffs over the last year, right? That makes them a less competitive company. It makes U.S. production of autos less competitive, right? And they've also closed plants in Ohio. Many companies have announced lower profits due to the impact of trade war uncertainty, right? And if you look at these kinds of shocks, they're not necessarily taking us back to the industries of yore, right? If you look even at the steel sector, it's not actually doing that well these days. But what we are doing is we're generating new shocks, new disruption, new things that need to be adjusted to. And I think that's a serious threat to workers. But a second threat from tariffs is to workers' purchasing power. If you look at tariffs, they tend to be paid by households, and the studies after studies shows that, right? And tariffs are a regressive consumption tax. They're actually more regressive than your typical sales tax. They're more regressive than your typical VAT. And so the regressive nature, the fact that poor people pay more tariffs than rich people, comes from 3 factors. One, poor people are spending all their income, whereas rich people can save some of it. But also poor people disproportionately consume imports in their consumption bundles. And our tariff structure itself is disproportionately harms the types of things that poor people buy, as it turns out. I mean, we could put big tariffs on luxury jewelry and autos, but we actually put really high tariffs on things like cheap footwear and cheap clothing, right? And so that makes this tax particularly unfair to those at the bottom of the income distribution. Actually, if you calculate the additional tariff costs faced by U.S. households, for the bottom half of the population, they're paying more in extra tariffs than they received in the Trump tax cuts. Another perspective to keep in mind is if you go back in history, you know, the U.S. government used to fund a lot of its operations with tariffs, and one of the reasons that they stopped doing that and moved towards the income tax in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, was because they were worried about the fact that tariffs fell disproportionately on poor workers, and the income tax stood a chance at reaching those at the top of the distribution. Right, so I think relying on tariffs is actually kind of adding insult to injury for the American worker, because you're not only creating new shocks, but you're also hurting them as consumers. Okay, finally, tariffs hurt our international relations, and that may sound like a sort of indirect thing to, you know, think about from a worker's perspective, but there are a lot of problems like climate change, for instance, that affect people on a day-to-day basis and that require international cooperation to solve. So if you're not getting along well with others, right, those problems are going to be difficult to solve. And I know it's not really in vogue to care about other countries, but if we look at the share of the world population that's below the World Bank poverty line, and that's $1.90 a day, the world is the blue boxes. You'll see it used to be about 40% of the world lived below that World Bank poverty line. Now it's actually a little under 10% if we fast forwarded to today. The red circles give you China, right? So this economic growth abroad, I'm not going to say is due to trade, but it would be a lot harder in a closed economy than it would have been in an open economy. If China and the world as a whole didn't have access to foreign ideas, foreign markets, you know, foreign capital and the like, its growth would have been slower. And this is one of the most sort of encouraging economic stories in all of history, right here. It's been accompanied by big increases in life expectancy and education, right, and health improvements, right? So this isn't just income, this is a real increase in the felicity of humankind. And importantly, I would point out that this has occurred at a time where in rich countries, GDP is continuing to rise. So the gain in poor countries is not coming at the expense of rich countries, right? Trade is not a zero-sum game. We've got increases in GDP per capita in the United States over this time period that are over 65%, you know, per person in real terms, right? So the problem is really one of distribution, not of, you know, poor countries gaining and us losing, right? And as an aside, trade deficits themselves are not a measure of who wins and loses for trade, and I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But the trade deficits come from countries borrowing more than they spending more than they earn, such that they borrow. So any country that is borrowing on international markets is running a trade deficit, and any country that's lending on international markets is running a trade surplus. And if you look at trade policy, it's not the case that countries with higher trade barriers have better deficits. They don't. They actually, on net, have slightly worse deficits. Because it's really a savings feature that generates that outcome, not trade policy. So you've actually seen the U.S. trade deficit expand over the last couple of years, despite the fact that we're pursuing all this protectionist trade policy. Okay, so in a nutshell, trade does generate a lot of disruption, but my argument here is that trade also comes with enormous benefits, just like technological change does. And raising trade barriers as a response to American workers is a really indirect way to help them, and in fact is more likely to hurt them than help them once you take into account all of these mechanisms. Okay, so let's talk next about immigration. This one's actually even easier because it's actually hard to find losers due to immigration. If you look at the evidence, and there have been literally hundreds of economic analyses of immigration into the United States, there's just no serious evidence that it's hurt our economic growth, that it's hurt most groups in the United States, and there's a couple little tiny exceptions that are even quite contested. Immigration appears to be good for the country, for the immigrants, for most groups in the country, and you know, there are just very few losers in this story. Now, if you look in the United States, you see that immigration has increased a lot in recent decades. It's now almost 14%, if we update to today, of the U.S. population is foreign-born, and this includes both undocumented as well as documented immigrants. The undocumented are a little less than a quarter of that total, and most of them, by the way, overstay their visas. They don't just kind of come across on the border. Immigrants are far from evenly spread out, so this is the national statistic, but if you look at the concentration of where immigrants are, you'll see that they're definitely more concentrated in some places than in others. I looked up the Rhode Island statistics, and the Rhode Island is really close to the national average. About 14% of the population of Rhode Island is foreign-born. California, it's 27%. Montana, it's 2%. So it really varies based on where you are. And an interesting sort of fact about public opinion is that if you look at the places where immigrants are most concentrated, those are also the places where they're the most popular among the native answers of surveys, right? So the places where immigrants are rarely found, the sort of middle swath of the country, is where people are quite fearful of them. So some feel that the amount of immigration that we have today is too much, right? And that's taken the form in the U.S. administration of actual policy changes. The attempt to build the wall is just one part of this strategy. There's also been increased vetting and obstacles for legal immigration, reduced refugee quotas, and so forth. In other countries, there's also been important backlashes against immigrants. In the UK, it was a big impetus for Brexit, is sort of anti EU migration policies. But you've also seen this in many other countries. So I would argue there are dangers to workers of restricting immigration as well, and these dangers are quite substantial. So the first danger is that the U.S. economy, if we focus on the U.S. here, would lose a lot of talent and innovation. Now, Nobel Prizes aren't everything, but if you look over the period 1977 to 2015, U.S.-based researchers won 65% of the scientific Nobel Prizes, right? So that's pretty impressive. Of those Nobel Prizes won in scientific fields by U.S.-based researchers, 46% of that total were American-born, 54% were foreign-born, right? So if you're looking at where our big ideas are coming from, they're often from foreign-born researchers. If you look at our graduate students in computer science and engineering, these are areas where we have substantial skill shortages. Over half of the graduate students in the United States are foreign-born students, right? Many of these students want to stay and work in the United States, and often we make it very difficult for them to do so. They're entitled to a few years, but then they're subject to visa lotteries and various processes, and some of them get discouraged and go home. They want to stay, right? So if we make our environment even less appealing to immigrants, we lose that source of talents and innovation, and that's really important source of American know-how and expertise and growth. So a second big loss to restricting immigration is we lose entrepreneurs and job creators. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, 40% of them were founded by either an immigrant or an immigrant's child. If you look at our billion-dollar startups, half of them were founded with an immigrant as part of their founding team. Immigrants disproportionately found small businesses as well, right? And so that job creation is important because when you think about immigrants coming to the United States, you often think about, well, they're a source of labor supply, right? And so maybe that would depress wages. But an important thing to keep in mind is they're also a source of labor demand. They're hiring people, they're creating new industries and new companies, right? And so the effects on wages really, in theory, should be ambiguous, right? Because they're both creating new job opportunities and filling jobs, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. A third risk from restricting immigration is we lose important parts of the labor force. I referred to the scientists and engineers, that's one part, but we also get a lot of unskilled labor from immigrant populations, and that's an important part of our economy. They often do work that it's otherwise difficult to sort of fill those jobs in agriculture or in elder care and child care, and having those workers enables other people to be more productive than they would be otherwise. And a fourth danger to restricting immigration is the demographic pressures of an aging society. So if you look at the United States, we have about 3 retirees for every 10 workers. And that feels pretty burdensome. Social Security and Medicare weigh heavily on the budget, and it will weigh even more heavily over the next decade. We complain a lot about financing those programs for old people, but imagine you're in Japan, right? In Japan, there are 8 retirees for every 10 workers, not 3, right? That's a much bigger demographic burden. In Italy, there are 5 retirees for every 10 workers, not 3, right? And the reason that Japan and Italy have these less healthy demographic ratios is in part because they haven't had as long a tradition of immigration. And it's not just the current immigrants coming in that help, it's the recent generations of immigrants who have higher fertility rates than older generations of immigrants that have been in the United States longer. So this is a big advantage of having a society that's open to immigrants, is that you have a sort of a healthier demographic burdens. So by now you're probably convinced that immigrants are awesome, which is true. So then you might wonder, well, what is the possible problem? Why is there all this backlash against immigrants? And I think it really comes from three concerns. One is this wage concern, that immigrants will drive down the wages of native workers. And as I mentioned before, this is theoretically complicated by the fact that immigrants both hire workers and fill jobs. And it's also empirically difficult to figure out. So you might say, okay, well, we could just look and see where the immigrants are, and it looks like there's some in California and these other vibrant places. And the places where there aren't immigrants actually tend to be slower growth places. So perhaps immigrants are good for job creation. But that's not enough, because you might think, well, if you're an immigrant, you're going to go to the places that are thriving. You're not going to go to the sort of backwater places that aren't creating jobs, right? So we can't really sort out the causality with geographic variation, because immigrants get to choose where to go, right? And we can't sort it out with time variation, because immigrants get to choose when to go, right? So what we really need is some sort of experimental variation, and occasionally you get this. So for instance, 1980, Castro, the Cuban government, allowed, on a temporary basis, for political reasons, a group of Cubans to leave out of the Port of Mariel. It was the Mariel boat lift. And 120,000 of them came to Miami for this random political reason, right? That increased the low-skilled labor force in Miami by 20%, like overnight. So that sounds to me a lot like a natural experiment. And it's been kind of a good opportunity for Cubans, but also a good opportunity for economists, because they could look at that data and say, okay, well, what happened in the Miami labor market as a consequence of that? And there have been several really careful studies, and they basically show very little wage effect, right? Because basically the demand and the supply side of this roughly cancel, and wages were kind of similar in Miami before and after this. So that's one possible concern. But in general, the literature suggests that there's not a big wage depressing effect. The one possible exception would be to teenage workers or to recent generations of immigrants, where there's some, controversial research that suggests that those groups could be hurt, right? But then you also have to ask, well, is restricting immigration the best solution for teenage workers who are often high school dropouts, the ones that are being hurt, or by recent generations of immigrants, right? Because the argument for recent generations of immigrants is to say, okay, well, they've already benefited a lot from coming to the United States, so their wage growth is a little slower because more immigrants came. That's maybe not such a big policy concern. And for the high school dropouts, it doesn't seem like the answer is to restrict immigration, is to address the reason they're dropping out of high school. So that's one issue. There's also worries about state and local budget stress. So for instance, if you're in some parts of the country, you're going to face more budgetary impact if immigrants are using a lot of services, right? And the National Academies of Sciences has done sort of a comprehensive overview survey that suggests the state and local budget cost could be as high as $1,700 for groups of immigrants that aren't highly skilled. But they also point out that the next generation, so the children of those same immigrants, actually is a fiscal boon, because the children of immigrants actually reliably pay more in taxation than they receive in benefits, to roughly a similar size magnitude that the first generation of unskilled workers cost. So if you take a long-run perspective, those budgetary problems are less of a downside, but that is one concern. And a final concern is what I would vaguely call cultural concerns, that immigrants are somehow creating some sort of cultural harm. But I would point out that the data here also do not support any reason for alarm. There have been studies very carefully that show that immigrants have lower crime rates, for instance, both the documented and the undocumented, that they actually are assimilating more quickly now than they did in earlier generations, and that they, on net, have positive effects on their local institutions and human capital attainment. So in the end, it seems to me very clear that we should have, if anything, more immigrants, not less, and I suggest actually policies to expand the immigrant population in the book. And I would also point out that some of these arguments don't need to be narrowly economic. I think there's a strong moral case for being open to refugees, for instance, or as Emma Lazarus would put it, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. We have a lot to offer those people, and they have a lot to offer us. They often become enthusiastic Americans. Any of you who've had sriracha sauce might reflect on the fact that Huy Fong Foods was actually named after the boat that took that refugee from Vietnam to the United States. And he founded a company. He named it after the boat that brought him here, and he's been quite delightedly making that wonderful sauce in California ever since. Okay, so to recap, the argument here is that American workers have real problems, yet the trade barriers and border walls are more likely to harm workers than help them. So the next really, I think, important question is what to do, right? Because I think the real problems that American workers are facing are actually leading to an assessment that these nationalistic economic policies are more attractive than they otherwise would be, right? Because you could sort of blame others and hope to solve the problem that way. So the last section of the book, I basically suggest better policy responses that can be loosely grouped into several categories: supporting workers, better tax reform, and what I call a better partnership with business. But what the common theme is to all of those policy solutions is they attempt to go straight to the problem. And I think that that's, whenever you're looking for a good sort of economic policy solution, ask yourself, does this go directly to the problem, or are we relying on some really Byzantine, multi-stage process for it to help? So for instance, if we think a tariff's going to help workers, right, we have to think, well, the tariffed industry wage growth has to be higher than the other industries that might get hurt by that tariff, right? And then we have to count on that effect being greater than the extra consumption costs that they have at the store, right? So it gets very complicated. But if you wanted to just help workers, you could just give them money, right? I mean, you can give them negative tax rates through the earned income tax system. You can support workers through a better safety net, better education, better access to community college for retraining purposes, more adequate healthcare services and the like. Going straight to the policy problem is usually the most effective thing to do. And the same is true with climate change, for instance. Like, carbon is the problem. The problem isn't, that we have too much of X, Y, and Z. The carbon is the problem, right? So if you're going to address that, right, then you might think, well, again, trade barriers would be sort of an indirect way to do that. We might restrict some types of trade and some carbon footprints, but we'd also be counting on that to not lead to even more carbon-intensive processes at home or other knock-on effects, right? Okay, so in terms of supporting workers, I suggest things like wage insurance, expanding the earned income tax credit, free community college, making public investment in places that have been hurt by disruption. But one really important part of the puzzle, and the one that I'm going to spend the remainder of the time on, is talking about the tax code. So the tax system allows us actually to make sure that our economy is one where when there's more GDP, that everybody benefits. We've actually got a really powerful tool in the tax code because we can create negative tax rates at the bottom. We could take more from those at the top. And then anytime GDP goes up, right, we can sort of reverse this tendency for the incomes to all be at the top by taking more there and then moving it down, right? And it's a really useful response that goes directly to some of these concerns. So let me sort of describe a good tax reform, but first let me tell you what not to do. In 2017, we had something called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, despite its title, did not really create a lot of jobs. It did create a lot of tax cuts, that's true. There were about $650 billion in corporate tax cuts. And again, relying on a really indirect mechanism to help workers, right? The corporate tax cuts are supposed to lead to more investment. That's supposed to increase worker productivity. And that's supposed to increase wages. The administration argued wages would go up $4,000 to $9,000, right? And we have not seen that. Wages have been flat. So we've had these big corporate tax cuts. We had $250 billion worth of pass-through business tax cuts, which mostly go to those at the top. There's a host of individual tax cuts which expire, but that are also skewed towards the top, which include estate tax cuts, among others. If you look at that legislation, there are four really big problems. One, it makes inequality worse. The tax cuts received by the bottom 80% of the population average about $800 at the beginning of the period, and then end up being a tax increase at the end of the legislation of $15. Those small tax cuts are outweighed by the fact that health insurance premiums went up a lot because that legislation built in it a sort of a toxic weakening of the mandate to buy health insurance. And because of that, now fewer people are buying health insurance, which is raising health insurance premiums for the typical family by more than that tax cut, to say nothing of the fact that the tariffs are also cutting into the benefits. Whereas those at the top got $50,000 worth of tax cuts for the top 1% that eventually fall to only $20,000 of tax cuts by the end of the 10-year window. But you'll notice they're still quite a bit larger than what people at the bottom are getting. So it's a regressive tax change. It's also deficit financed. It generates about $2 trillion worth of deficits if you include the interest cost over 10 years. So that's less money that we have for various priorities. It made the tax code more complicated, actually, on the business side, quite a bit more complicated. And it actually directly encouraged both offshoring of jobs by exempting the first 10% return on assets on foreign income, and encouraged the profit shifting of corporate income offshore. So I think it's very problematic legislation. So what I would suggest is that the first thing that we do is think about a better tax reform. What would that look like? I think it should have three key principles. One is making sure everyone gains from changes that increase GDP, right? By expanding the earned income tax credit at the bottom is one really effective way to do that. You could pay for that by raising taxes at the top. Now, raising taxes at the top is complicated by the fact that people at the top have a lot of accountants and lawyers to help them minimize their taxes. So rather than raising some rates to 70% and leaving others at 20, right, which some people have actually suggested, I think it would make more sense to kind of make sure that whatever form the income is earned in, whether it's capital or labor, whether it's abroad or at home, you're taxing it in an even way. And then you can actually raise a lot of revenue at pretty reasonable tax rates, these in the low 30s or high 20s even, if you're taxing capital and labor income the same, and if you're taxing foreign and domestic income of companies the same. So that's another principle that can raise a lot of revenue. A third principle is I think a carbon tax is long overdue and an important part of this tax reform because climate change is really important, and a carbon tax incentivizes each and every actor in the economy to take into account their carbon footprint when they're deciding whether to fly, when they're deciding what kind of building to build, when they're deciding whether to invest in a new industry. They will think about the carbon footprint. On the left, people don't like carbon taxes at times because they're concerned they're regressive. But again, if you pair it with this package I've talked about of expanding the negative tax rates at the bottom, you could even hand the carbon tax revenue back on an even per capita basis. And actually, the bottom 70% of the population would be better off. But you'd still be discouraging carbon, and that's a really important thing to be doing. And of course, we need to spend more on R&D and in green technology and things like that too. But tax revenue can help with that kind of spending. Okay, so let me just conclude with a final thought. The 2016 election, which we all remember well, reflected a lot of factors. But on Inauguration Day, the big promise that Trump made to the American people was to put America first, right? And if you look at the inauguration speech, that's in there like over and over and over again. It's just this long sort of nationalistic statement. And you might think, oh, that's just a speech. But it's really been at the core, to the extent that there's a coherence, which I'm reluctant to say that there is, in this administration's policy, it's really built around that theme of America first, right? It's been used to rationalize tariffs, trade wars, bargaining with foreign countries, immigration barriers. And the United States isn't alone in embracing these sort of nationalistic sets of policies. They've been copied and innovated themselves. And in other countries, too. We see in Brazil a more nationalistic outlook. In Poland and Hungary and other places that nationalistic economic policies are more popular than they used to be. I think that rising tide of nationalism is, of course, very dangerous. If you go back to the last big era of globalization, it was also coincident with income inequality. And it ended with the rise of nationalism, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression. I don't think, it's an exaggeration to say that these issues aren't important. The economic discontent that we have right now creates a situation where those types of policies of blaming others is a really attractive thing to do. And this is dangerous, I think, to the prosperity of workers both here and abroad. But as important, it also distracts us from things that we could do to actually address those problems. We come up with these sort of solutions of blame that ultimately add insult to injury for workers, but we don't actually do the hard grinding work of building up the fundamentals of the economy, of making sure that economic growth is inclusive and things like that. So I think this is a really important time to get economic policy right, and I know we can do better than we have been, so I look forward to answering any questions that you have. I can take the questions myself, Mark said, and so, yes. Yes, in the back you had a question, I think. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm like a somewhat ignorant college student, who's still pretty young, trying to figure out his positions on like public policy, politics, what's going on, what I should care about, what should I care about, and I'm often like confused about what to prioritize.
Yes.
Like, is free trade really making so much of a difference that it should be the primary factor I consider when evaluating public policy and politicians? Is free borders or freedom of immigration making the biggest difference? How do we sort of weigh the relative benefits and then the relative cost? And are all the costs sort of negligible in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And to be clear, I don't think that greater trade liberalization should be the first priority of any, future administration, say. I think we've actually done a good job with that already. But I guess the argument I would make here is that responding to economic inequality and wage stagnation should be a first priority, because that can lead to harmful knock-on effects that would actually make trade and other things, a lot more difficult, right? I mean, you could sort of imagine a scenario where countries do get more isolationist in their approach to all sorts of problems, right? And that makes it a lot harder to deal with some of our really important priorities. I think if I were an undergraduate sort of thinking about my priorities, I think climate change, for instance, would be right there at the top, right? I mean, climate change is a huge problem. But how do we solve that? That's a multi-country collective action problem. And it's a problem where even if one country has perfect climate policies, it's not enough. You need the whole world to proceed on this. And so I guess my argument would be, if that's your most important thing, what sets of policies can you imagine that would help support that, right? And so I can imagine a tax reform that includes a carbon tax, for instance. And I can also imagine that getting along with your allies would be important, right? Because you're kind of counting on international cooperation to address some of these big problems. And I think tax competition is another one, for instance, where to raise enough money for the state, we need to address that multilaterally. And so the argument here isn't that new trade agreements should be our number one thing to do. It's that restricting trade is harmful to all those things that we might otherwise prioritize, like climate change and dealing with economic inequality. And those would be my 1 and 2, those two issues. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. What has been the impact of immigration on African-American male employment, especially for African-American males that are either high school graduates or they're not high school graduates?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting set of controversial studies surrounding this Mariel boat lift, actually, because the first study done by David Card and his co-authors concluded that it didn't have a negative effect. And then there was a study by George Borjas and his co-authors that found that actually it did have a negative effect, and particularly for black workers in the area. But then it turns out there was a data collection error in that study, and that it didn't take into account of the fact that the census changed their sampling of black workers at the time. And so they had actually neglected to account for the fact that there were more people in the sample. And when you correct that error, the finding goes away. And so there's a third paper and all three of these are in a colorful box in the book, basically, where I talk about this controversy. But there's a third paper that makes it clear that it wasn't harmful in that context. So that's an area of dispute, right, I would say, because although Borjas admits that there was that statistical error, but I haven't seen a lot of compelling evidence that there are systematic negative effects. Right, and I think that one argument why there wouldn't be would be because in theory, right, immigrants create demand as well as supply, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But of course, The other area where we also see some negative effects are in the high school dropout population, and that's not even across races either, right? So to the extent that, low socioeconomic status people are more likely to drop out from high school, right, then that's going to be another area where you'd want to worry. But again, my argument would be that the first best approach to that is to have the spending and the community support to make those communities thrive on their own, and that removing immigrants from the equation isn't really going to be a first order thing to address the underlying policy problems.
But has there been any studies that specifically focus on African American males, independent of African American people in general? Because my sense is, this is just an educated guess, that, for African American females, it would be a little bit different.
Yeah.
But my concern is especially for urban African American males, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York City.
Yeah, no, I agree that that's an important concern. I'm not aware of those studies, but also I should caution you that I don't have a sort of an encyclopedic recall of everything in that area, so I could certainly look into it. But I think that my theoretical priors would be that there isn't a reason to suspect that that would be, disproportionately harmful there. But that doesn't mean there aren't some studies that show that. I didn't see that. I did read the National Academy of Sciences review that went through kind of like a really comprehensive review of all of the studies in this area, and I did not see that called out as a point of particular concern. Peter.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the book, and I'll get it signed.
Yeah.
I can situate your presentation, your book, to the extent that I know the contents, in relationship to your main foil, which is sort of current U.S. policy and its direction, where it's going. I guess what I want to push you on is the subtitle, The Progressive Case For, because then I think, okay, how do you situate yourself in the progressive camp? So I'm thinking, okay, the public intellectuals out there, the Stiglitzes, the Robert Reichs of the world, is this different, and if so, how, from what they've been articulating already?
Yeah, so the progressive camp comes in lots of different flavors on these issues, and I guess part of the point of the subtitle was to argue that if you put workers at the center of your economic policy wants, right? If you say they're most important, they're more important than GDP or any number of things, there is a good case for open rather than closed, is kind of the argument that I'm making. There's been some serious pushback from the left on these arguments, in part because there's a tendency of some to blame trade agreements for a lot of what they see around us, right? So for instance, NAFTA, for some reason, and I'm perplexed by this, to be honest, is thought of as a great big boogeyman in this area, because first we had sort of Ross Perot arguing that it would create this giant sucking sound. NAFTA was started in 1994. Actually, the second half of the 90s were the single best labor market period of my lifetime for the American working class. Wage growth was actually kind of spectacular during that period. So if you just look at sort of time series evidence, it's like not clear NAFTA's to blame. If you look at careful cross-section evidence, there's very little evidence that NAFTA created big harms for, a serious number of workers. Yet, you see ads in the 2016 primary, for instance, on the Democratic side. You saw Bernie Sanders running ads in Michigan, where he had, NAFTA one screen, then, desolate neighborhoods next screen, NAFTA, desolate neighborhoods. And I think the point, of course, was to attack Hillary Clinton, right, whose husband's administration had done that, and she helped negotiate TPP, right? And so it was effective politically, but you can't tell me that NAFTA is responsible for what happened in Detroit, right? I really think that we could say trade had a lot to do with that. We could say the overvaluation of the dollar in the 1980s had a lot to do with that. We could say that technological change had a lot to do with that, but the provisions of NAFTA, per se, there's just very little evidence that had anything to do with that, right? So I think among the left, I think there is this tendency to get really worked up about provisions of particular trade agreements and to assert that those are at the heart of what's wrong with our priorities in policy. And I think that that's misguided, because I think you could design for the rest of time the most perfect trade agreement you wanted, with all sorts of labor supports, like the the dream of the far left. And you could implement those everywhere you went, and that wouldn't change anything about those pictures that we've just seen of what was happening to American workers, because trade agreements are just kind of noise. Like, they're not even addressing, the terms of trade liberalization, which is mostly decided by foreign countries deciding what their policies should be. It's not about the terms of some trade agreement. So I think in a way it's all this distraction from things that are much more effective, right? I would love to see people working more on, like, how to get money into workers' hands, how to get money into the hands of struggling communities, how to invest in things like infrastructure, right? And so I think that part of the reason I wrote this book is I was wary of the Democrats' response to Trump being like, oh, he's right. In the sense that it seems to really sell when we blame outgroups for our problems. And therefore, we too are going to blame outgroups for our problems. And we're not going to be as open a country to immigrants, and we're not going to be as open to our trading partners, because it's a lot easier to blame somebody in another country than to redistribute income or to make public investments, right? And so I that's the argument I'm trying to make here. But it's been very unpopular with both the far left and the far right. I think the far left is deeply, deeply skeptical of trade agreements and thinks they're way more important than they are, I think, counter to the evidence. And the far right just doesn't like all the suggestions that I have about how to do anything about it. They're like, oh, we like the part about, trade being not all bad, but we're not sure that we should do anything about, that.
So you spoke about initially.
Hang on a sec, so we're getting my
Sure. First of all, thank you.
Sure.
So you spoke about initially that the way in which the current administration frames trade in terms of a deficit isn't the issue that they frame it to be.
Yes.
My question has to do with the idea of fair trade, and how much is that a problem? How can we rectify that, or is it not even a problem that we can worry in terms of kind of stealing IP and things like that?
Yeah, so the intellectual property issues are a problem in the sense that the U.S. industries have a sort of a collective interest in protecting the ownership of the innovation that they have invested in, and if you that gives the U.S. a sort of a national interest in that as well, because you want companies like Google and Apple to be, American companies, because they generate an enormous amount of profit, right? So I think from a nationalistic perspective, it sort of makes sense. But I guess the question becomes, how important is that, and how much should our trade policy be driven by that, right? So first, in the how important is that question, right, in a way we could sort of argue that intellectual property theft is like a common pattern of all of industrial time, right? Like, Britain industrialized over a couple hundred years, and then the U.S., when we industrialized, we took a lot of the innovations that we saw there. It's not like we invented them from scratch, and then we did it quicker. And then when Japan was industrialized, and they took ideas that we had in the United States. And then when China's industrialized, and they take ideas, and then it always speeds up. So our industrialization takes half the time, and so does Japan's takes half of what we took, and so forth. So to some extent, I think this borrowing of ideas and knowledge across borders is a helpful thing for raising living standards throughout the world, and we should just enjoy that. But of course, there are some zero-sum elements to who owns and who controls intellectual property, and if that's stolen and exploited, then that's something that you'd want to take seriously and counter. And then the question becomes, well, what's the effective way to do that? I would argue that the effective way to do it, so if you're worried about Chinese intellectual property theft, right, you might think, okay, well, we should work with other allies who are also worried about that. We negotiated the TPP in part to have a bunch of friends, right, in the Pacific region who might be, useful allies in questions like this. The European Union is also worried about intellectual property issues. So you could imagine partnering with allies that you're getting along with well to sort of exert some soft pressure in this area. And if we contrast that to the current strategy, which appears to be willy-nilly random tariff assignments and threats and trade policy by tweet, and it's really unclear to me that strategy is very effective. I think it's not. I don't think it's effective in its stated aims. I think it creates a lot of collateral damage, and I think it's a big vulnerability of this administration that they haven't delivered anything whatsoever, despite all of the business uncertainty they've created, and so I agree that it's a potentially aspects of this are problematic, but I think we've had entirely the wrong approach to it. You in the back there. Oh, sorry, there's a woman in a white shirt. Let's go with you. waiting for a woman to ask a question. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank
Hi,
you.
sure.
Thank you for coming. With the decline of labor union participation that you talk about a bit in the book, and like the major like power of like corporations, I'm just wondering like, would increasing labor union participation make a difference, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I think it would make a huge difference. I think actually one of the things that economists are not good at talking about or analyzing is power. But I think power is, really important, bargaining power and other types of power. And unionization decline has had a big effect on wage growth. And since union jobs were typically in the past manufactured jobs, and now are disproportionately public sector jobs like teachers unions and the like, I mean, we don't really think that that's achieving the purpose that we thought. Unions were supposed to sort of counter the sort of market power of private companies, not try to extract accessions from the state, on behalf of teachers or whatever. I mean, I'm nothing against teachers unions, but I think the step forward in this area is to sort of work on unionizing service sector jobs. I mean, that's where we have a lot of jobs in the economy, and that we're not going to go back to the sort of heyday of manufacturing where most of our people are in manufacturing. So I think the service sector is the one where you really sort of have to push unionization efforts to try to make those jobs good jobs, because those are the jobs of the future. And like I said, some service jobs are already good jobs, and those people don't need to be unionized. But I think that's an area where I think that union leaders and collective action should really emphasize is how to empower service workers, because there's a lot to be had there. And I think tax, actually, I hate to hit everything with the tax thing, but I think it actually has a role in this bargaining story too, right? When you cut taxes at the top dramatically, right, that gives people at the top a larger incentive to bargain for pay because they get to keep most of it, right? Whereas if you're going to only keep half of it, do you really care whether they pay you as much? So I think tax policy has a role to play here too, but unionization is super important.
Anyone else?
In the back on the blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious, what service jobs do you see as opening in the future for low-skilled workers? I know retail has been declining as well as manufacturing, so I'm curious about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I don't have a great answer to that, but I think it's one thing that's really noticeable to me in looking at the economy is that we don't have a number of job problem, we have a quality of job problem. So when industries shift, it's not like the jobs have just disappeared, right? There are still jobs out there, they're just not particularly good jobs, right? And knowing what the industries of the future are is always a complicated thing, but people used to really sort of wring their hands about what would happen when agricultural productivity increases made the decline of the family farm a thing. So it used to be like 75% of Americans worked on farms, right? Now less than 2% of Americans have anything to do with farm output, right? And somehow all those people who used to work on farms managed to do a bunch of other stuff, right? And now we've got a similar issue with manufacturing. Now we can make an awful lot of manufacturing goods without people being involved, just like you can farm entire, mile square things with really capital-intensive farm equipment. You don't need a lot of people out there, right? And so that does generate the opportunities for new industries, and it can be things like, therapy and massage and cutting hair and stuff like that, and also, brand new things that we may not have thought about yet that still could emerge, right? Like we didn't know the internet was going to be a thing 30 years ago, and that's generated a lot of new jobs. So I don't know the answer to that question, but what I would suggest is that to make sure that those jobs are satisfying jobs, in addition to focusing on empowering service workers, I think negative tax rates through the earned income tax credit is a really smart way to do it. And the earned income tax credit right now is very generous for people with children. You get 40 cents back for every dollar you earn if you have 2 children and you're getting the earned income tax credit. And that can turn into $6,000 extra a year, which is a lot. But it's very skimpy for those who don't have kids. It's like 7.5 cents a dollar, and it tops out at like 500 and something. So there have been some proposals that are out there right now to make that more generous, and I think those are long overdue, and would sort of put more hands in regular people's pockets, right? Which they can more money in regular people's pockets, and then they would be able to go forward and spend money in new entrepreneurial areas. You had a question for a long time, right
sorry.
behind. Yeah.
I'll get to you.
Yeah, so I understand the policy case you make here, and I think
Yeah.
you've thought through most of the key issues, but I don't envision the political coalition that would be able to achieve a lot of these policies. And I'm particularly concerned about this way forward, given the fact that we're seeing pro-globalization coalitions fray everywhere, including in Scandinavia, social democratic countries, that have already a lot of these policies you suggest, and actually much more. And still we see a crisis in these countries. So could you maybe outline what the political coalition looks like to achieve this? And is there any part of this that you might give on in order to achieve that coalition? So I'm thinking in particular maybe financial globalization. You didn't really mention that in the talk.
Yeah.
Perhaps there is a case to be made to restrict financial flows to a certain extent, and would that possibly help the politics of this?
Yeah, so I think the case for global capital I didn't talk a lot about, in part because I was making the argument in the book about the trade deficit, which is international borrowing, which really hasn't been that harmful to the United States. But I do agree that financial liberalization across countries is not a huge priority. So in terms of the political coalition, I think the smart thing to do, if you're sort of a thinking person in the center left, and you want to sort of harness some of this concern, maybe even some of this nationalist concern in a productive direction, is to focus on the multinational company issue and say, okay, it's true multinational companies do a lot of good things. Like, we all like our Apple products. I do. Yeah, that's awesome. But they also pay very little taxes because we've got a system that lets them create income that's taxed nowhere. Right, so we've got these highly profitable companies earning excess profits, and we let them escape taxation entirely. So I think a way to build a political coalition around taxing that income, it's a very popular thing to do, right? It's very America first, right? Because you could say, like, listen, we've got all this bias towards earning the income abroad in these havens, and we shouldn't have that because we could use that money at home, right? So you can use some of that same rhetoric, right? But you're actually making things more efficient, not less efficient, because the tax code is already sort of distorting things toward the havens. So by removing a distortion, you could sort of make an argument that you get to make somebody a bad guy, you get to be America first, and you get to sort of build sensibilities around there. I wouldn't kind of come in and say, like, well, we need to have a lot of trade agreements as our number one thing. I mean, I think you can do the popular parts of this, like helping communities adjust, expanding their income tax rate, stuff like that. I think it's actually could be quite popular. I think that the real caution here is to not do harm in some of these other areas. Like, immigration has been a tremendous success to the United States, but if you look at the polling data, people know that. Like, people are actually, on average, quite happy with immigration. And they're actually slightly more happy with trade now than they were a couple more years ago. And I think it's partly because the experience that we've had with tariffs has not been a real positive one. And you can find places in Europe where there's a backlash against the backlash, right? And it's not uniform, but there are some recent elections and other coalitions forming there that have said, it's not really clear that blaming immigrants has been successful. And partly maybe running these experiments in a few countries will help teach people that, you put up some tariffs and it doesn't help things at all. Brexit is not going to help England. I mean, they're not going to be a richer country because of that. So I think in a way having some policy mistakes out there will help us hopefully form a sensible political coalition for doing something about the sort of effective things we could do to help the middle class and the poor without just resorting to the sort of out-group scapegoating kind of thing. In the back, or there, yeah.
Thank you for a terrific talk. I was wondering about the potential role of a major push for infrastructure and public investment. So that was always promised by the Trump administration, never really materialized. Now the progressive left of the Democratic Party has also promised a Green New Deal. Now you mentioned carbon taxes as a kind of measure to do something on climate change, but I was wondering about the role of such a Green New Deal within your plans.
I think it's a great idea to spend money on infrastructure, including especially green infrastructure. It's true we have large deficits in debt, and so if we're debt financing stuff, technically we should worry about that. But, if you're thinking about infrastructure or green infrastructure, that pays a lot of dividends into the future. So it's one thing to sort of run a big deficit so that you can hand money to shareholders through corporate tax cuts or something like that. And it's another thing to run a big deficit to build highways and bridges and windmills and, other things that would either boost the infrastructure capacity of the country or respond, in a green way to some of our climate needs. So I think it's foolish that they haven't come up with a bipartisan bill on this, because this is something that should really be able to bring various coalitions together. But that seems like low-hanging fruit for the next round. And I do think a carbon tax is a good complement rather than a substitute to that, right? It gets you a little money, and it aligns the incentives with the green infrastructure that you're building, right? Because if wind has to compete with oil, which it does, right, one way to help them do that is make oil more expensive.
So I'm going to come back for 1 second on the claim that NAFTA didn't do anything, just for argument's sake, right? But it's a second order kind of argument, which is the following. What these trade agreements do is give capital optionality, but Labour doesn't have optionality. So Labour's stuck where it is. And under the old order, basically productivity and compensation moved together because one could credibly threaten the other. But once you have NAFTA, you can move 60% of your auto supply chain to Canada and another 20% to Mexico, and you can put 40% of your manufacturing in Mexico. That didn't happen before. You say, well, this is new growth, but it also gives them massive optionality. So the reason that you had high wage growth in that half decade was mainly EITC and a booming stock market. It wasn't really transfers to labour through labour compensation. And what you got was massive returns to capital because they're able to say to labour, don't like it, we'll move the job to Mexico, which is exactly what they have been doing. So isn't there really a problem here after all?
Okay, so first, the wage data are really good. If you just look at wage compensation in the second half of the 90s, if you look at poverty reduction, their earning income tax credit helps, but there's the real economic fundamentals. That is the best half decade of my life in terms of the good stuff that was happening. And it's not because of NAFTA. I guess my point is that it's not, NAFTA didn't stop that. And this North American, I agree that capital has optionality, but did NAFTA do that? Because we had a free trade agreement with Canada since 1989. We had free trade in auto parts since the 1960s, actually. So, so it's true you could say, well, all of those other things are what did this, right? And maybe the fact that we let companies operate abroad, which we don't prohibit that, right? So the agreement itself, I think it's actually a pretty small beans thing. So, you could say, okay, well, the fact that companies can move and people can't is a problem, right? But that's a very different policy problem than saying NAFTA is a problem, right? And it's true, that is a problem. And I think it does create, it's a policy problem because it creates a power discrepancy, right? And there are ways by encouraging unionization and appropriate tax and regulatory policies that we can respond to that. But I think to sort of pin something on a particular agreement, when really companies were free to move with or without that agreement for a long time, right? I think it's misleading to say, oh, this is all Bill Clinton and his friends foisting, harm onto the American worker. When if you wanted to point to one thing that NAFTA really did, it helped Mexico recover from the peso crisis of 1994. Because if we hadn't had this political commitment to NAFTA, we wouldn't care at all that they had this big crisis, and we wouldn't have shown up with a package of $55 billion of bailout money that they paid back ahead of schedule because it was a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem. That I blame on NAFTA, because if it weren't for NAFTA, we wouldn't have had the political will to do that. Yeah.
One last question from anyone, or are we done? I think we've hit the one. Whoop, there's
one in
the very back.
Yeah. He's
Didn't
had
see
one for a
him.
while.
Didn't see the.
Yeah.
The questioner here asked about Green New Deal proposals, and one of the things that I hear that would be lovely if it were true, but is that this would not just bring employment, but be redistributive, that the jobs would be better paying jobs than what we have now. Is there any evidence for that?
The Green New Deal jobs would be better jobs?
Yeah.
I think there's some thought that the sort of clean energy field in general is going to develop and become an important necessity, and that some countries' companies are going to end up being the ones that are sort of responsible for that innovation and get some of the rents associated with the sort of first mover technological change that accompanies that. And so I think some of the thought here is like, well, this is kind of the wave of the future, and if you can be the country that hosts the companies to come up with the solution, right, then you're going to get more of the high-paying jobs and more of the rents from that. So I think that's one of the arguments there. But it's not one that I think is more than speculative, right? Because, I think the real reason to make these investments is because we're worried about climate change. We need to do something about the future of the planet, right? And that's a pressing priority. And there's no reason to think those jobs will be bad jobs, but I don't think they're going to be a magic elixir either all by themselves.
And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks.